Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute for International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's late February 2023, and I want in this video to talk about something very much off the beaten track as far as I'm going to talk about, rather than money and banking and inflation and so on, I'm going to talk about something geopolitical. I think it's necessary to do this from time to time because big geopolitical shocks can have major economic consequences, and then any kind of monetary analysis is superseded. Now, we had this sort of a shock of this sort last autumn when Russia cut off the supply of gas pipeline gas to the rest of Europe. And there was a lot of alarm about the effects of that on inflation. And Goldman Sachs at one point came up with an inflation forecast for the UK of 22%. And the Institute is certainly concerned about what's happening to inflation. It's part of our remit. Well, last September, I had a look at that topic, and I produced a video with asking whether what Putin had done by cutting off the supply of gas was a masterstroke or a blunder. And I said it was a blunder. Essentially, the supply of liquefied natural gas had risen enormously in the previous 20, 30 years. And so there was actually really a global market in gas, which meant that Europe could supply itself even if pipeline gas from Russia were cut off. And so I said, although this was a shock, now as it turns out, we're now, getting off for 6 months later, we've had a mild winter, and the lights haven't gone off in Europe. Russia effectively has destroyed the main market for its gas, apart from Russia itself, permanently, which is a disaster for Russia. So that piece of analysis, not very difficult really, has been vindicated. But today we're facing a shock, possible shock, even larger than that. What I did last September was I also looked at the size of the Russian economy compared with that of the West. And the main point here is that the Russian economy, this is all measured, by the way, in terms of current prices, currency exchange rates. It should be clear that the value of the ruble is affected by energy prices and also such things as the invasion of the Ukraine, which of course put down the value of the ruble initially. The Russian economy is tiny relative to that of the West. By the West, I mean North America, Europe, Australasia, and Japan, essentially. Roughly, the West's economy is 30 times the size of Russia's. So, in the event of a prolonged military conflict in the Ukraine, with the West supplying military support to the Ukraine, ammunition, weapons, and so on, Russia is likely to lose. Whether that happens or not, I don't know, and we don't really know but something else is now going on. The leaders of China, Xi Jinping, Wang Yi, who's the foreign minister, are threatening to support Russia with weapons. They may be denying that publicly, but that is the intelligence information that the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has mentioned in the last few days. And I won't just say here that the military intelligence received by the USA and the UK ahead of the Ukraine invasion was very good. China, of course, has got a much larger economy than Russia. Indeed, it has, on some measures, the world's largest economy. So the impact of Chinese involvement in the conflict in this way could be shattering, could be completely change the balance of forces. And that's what I want to talk about now. So the first thing I want to do is to, it's possible, of course, that China won't do this, but I'll just talk about that at the end of this video. The first thing is to judge how large the Chinese economy is compared with that of the West. And then we want to look at the wider ramifications of Chinese engagement in the war in this fashion. There are different ways of measuring different nations' output. I'm again going to focus in this case on that using current exchange rates and current prices. We use this concept of North America, Europe, Australasia, Japan, then roughly speaking, and these things are not precise, the West has output that's about 3 times that of China. Let's also be clear that the West has by far the most advanced technologies, and that means military technologies too. I'm then getting into discussion about what proportion of output is devoted to the support of Ukraine. I'm sorry if this seems a bit scary, but that must be, in the extreme, what one's talking about. And it's clear that, again, although with much less clarity, the West ought to succeed in the end. Very important issues are at stake here because the whole post-war order depended upon this idea that one nation wouldn't invade another, and indeed the idea of the United Nations was that the main powers on the Security Council of the UN would implicitly guarantee national borders. Of course, Russia, member of the Security Council, has of course breached that. But well, the problem here is the West may not be united. And so we have a clear challenge here to maintain the unity of the West against this possible behavior by China. But let's then think about some of the ramifications of the possible decision by Chinese leaders to support Russia. China is the world's largest exporter. It's the world's largest importer of commodities. The possible sanctions against China would obviously include the withdrawal of supply of things like iron ore from Australia. Would Brazil go along with that? The question of the interruption of oil supplies from the Middle East. Would Saudi Arabia go along with that? Then further implications for all of the huge investments that Western companies have made in China. Would they be stolen? China might say it's fair enough. If that's the way the West wants to behave, then it'll take these foreign investments. Because let's just be clear that what the USA and Europe and Japan have done is to freeze the foreign exchange reserves held by Russia in the USA, Europe, Japan, and in effect those dollars, euros, yen, and so on have been lost to Russia. Is the same thing to apply to China if it goes down this route of supporting Russia in this war? I'm raising all of these points because this is actually a more serious crisis than if the Chinese do go down this route, than any that we've seen really perhaps since the Cuban crisis of the early 60s or even possibly since 1945. The trouble has arisen because China has become an enormous economic power by joining the post-1945 international order. Yet the death of Chairman Mao was followed by governments, Chinese governments, that opened up the economy to trade, finance, investment, and it was a huge success. But now we have a Chinese leadership that doesn't seem to understand these things and therefore is threatening the West, in effect. They say they're being bullied by the West, because obviously these conversations are going on at a high level at the moment. I think really as citizens and investors, we can only watch these events with some alarm. The puzzle may be, why is the Chinese leadership going in this direction when it's apparently suicidal and crazy? Well, we don't really appreciate, cannot understand what's going on in China properly. Obviously, it's a different political culture, different language from us, and the way that these societies work is that the people at the top depend upon support from the army and the secret police. Because obviously the army and the secret police can kill political opponents. And that is the way these societies work. Obviously it happens in Russia at the moment. It's happened in Russia, in a sense, for most of the 20th century. So, Mr. Xi, who is a very nasty and unpleasant man, may take a decision which apparently is catastrophic for both China and indeed for the world as a whole. I hope this video has been helpful and interesting. I hope I'm all completely wrong, but nevertheless we need to focus on these issues. And we'll come back to talking about the money supply, banking and systems and so on in due course. But for the moment, I think we need to think very hard about what's happening here. Thank you.